I'm Trevor Phillips. This is Common Ground, where each week we look for agreement on a hot-button issue dividing the nation. Tonight...
Strikes should be the last resort, not the first resort, Mr. Speaker. They'll stop customers choosing rail, they'll put jobs at risk, they'll cause misery across the country, they'll hit businesses trying to recover from COVID.
The British worker needs a pay rise, they need job security, decent conditions, and a square deal in general. If we can get that, we won't have to have the disruption in the British economy that we've got now and which may develop across the summer.
You know, the current cost of living, we know that you need to get paid, but at the same time, don't hold the public to ransom.
We do need to see moderation of wage rises. Now, that's painful, but we need to see that in order to get through this problem more quickly.
We're not potentially getting a pay rise, you know, in the NHS and everything, and I kind of understand it, but it's not the people that you need to hit, they're not hitting.
They are the very same people the Prime Minister promised a high-wage economy to a year ago before presiding over the biggest fall in living standards since records began.
Britain's rail workers say that years of austerity and COVID have left them impoverished. Yet all the thanks they get for keeping the nation moving is a below-inflation pay offer and job insecurity. And they're not alone. Claims from teachers and doctors are coming down the track and picking up momentum. Ministers say that the country can't afford either the money or the aggravation. They accuse the workers of putting their own interests ahead of the nation. And after all, they say, who suffers? Other workers who can't get to their jobs, children who can't get to their exams, and patients who can't get to their treatment. Our choice: is this week's action a legitimate cry for help or just old-fashioned industrial greed? Who really does have the national interest at heart? In the next 30 minutes, two passionate believers come head-to-head in the search for common ground. With me tonight, Paul Nowak, the Deputy General Secretary of the TUC, and the Conservative MP Claire Coutinho, who is also a Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Treasury. Thank you both for being here. And Paul, there's no need to explain why you're not in London today, but thank you for being it. There's no real argument here about the right to strike. I don't think that's our topic for tonight. The question is who's going to benefit from this particular action. So if I can start with you, Paul. After 2 years of COVID, with high inflation and a recession on the horizon, is this really the right moment to punish the commuter?
Well, I don't think punishing the commuter is at the forefront of those RMT workers' minds, Trevor. 40,000 of them voted to take industrial action. It's not a decision they would have taken lightly. Each single one of those workers is going to lose pay. But I think they've done it because they feel that they have no alternative. They're worried about compulsory redundancies. They're worried about yet another real terms pay cut. And so that they, you know, after trying, I have to say, through many, many months of negotiations and trying to move both the transport employers and the government, they felt that they've had no alternative at all. And now, I was speaking to some of those pickets today in Liverpool, my hometown. These are people who care deeply about the railways and the people that they serve. None of them want to be standing outside stations. They want to be in stations serving the travelling public, but they felt that they had no alternative. And I would hope that people would respect that decision, respect how difficult a decision it was.
And we're absolutely clear that the TUC stands four square behind the RMT in its action and its proposed actions, because Mr Lynch, the leader of the RMT, says this could go on for months.
Well, I'm pretty sure that Mick Lynch and his members don't want to go on for months. But what they absolutely want to see is a negotiated fair settlement. But absolutely those RMT workers have my support and the support of the TUC, and indeed any worker who took that difficult decision to take industrial action would have our support. You know, we talked a lot in the introduction there about the cost of living crisis. I'd argue our cost of living crisis in the UK is actually a wages crisis. If wages in this country had risen at the same rate they have on average across the OECD over the last decade, the average British worker would be £4,000 a year better off. Last year, the Prime Minister told us that he wanted to create a high-wage economy. Now he's telling us we need to exercise pay restraint. And those two things don't add up, Trevor. And I think we need a debate in this country about how are we going to get wages rising again.
All right, we'll come back to some of that detail. Claire Coutinho, you belong to a party which is reluctant for the state to step into people's day-to-day lives. I know you yourself support trade unionism. Why are you getting involved in an industrial dispute at all? Why are you here?
Well, so I represent a massive commuter area, and what these strikes mean is that for my workers, their best case scenario is that they work from home. The worst case scenario is they can't get to work and they won't get paid. So I think these strikes are very, very difficult for workers across the country. I think they're also very damaging to an economy which is in a fragile recovery, which we spent £400 billion on during the pandemic trying to preserve. And also, I don't think they're good for the rail workers themselves. If you look at what's happened in the railway industry, revenues are down, I think, something like 40% in some cases. Passengers have not returned back to the railways in the way that they were using them pre-COVID. And what they need to do to ensure, I think, a sustainable future is to attract passengers back, not push them away, and also make sure that they're making those modernising changes so that you can have a really efficient, productive service. That is good for the rail workers and it's good for passengers.
Well, I hear the case, and that's the case made by government ministers, but just dealing with your position as a Member of Parliament, representing your constituents. I mean, to some extent, you are representing an interest, legitimate, but just as sectional as the interest represented by the RMT. You are here and making the case for a group of people who don't want their lives disrupted. Paul Nowak and the RMT represent a group of people who feel that their lives have been impoverished. So this is a battle between sectional interests rather than one for the interest of the country as a whole, isn't it?
Well, I would actually slightly disagree with that, because one of the things that I think the rail industry is not doing is actually looking after the long-term interest of the rail workers themselves. And that's something which is, it's not, I'm just not saying it's just me. You had people like a former Labour Cabinet Minister, David Blunkett, this morning, who was saying the same thing. Because if you want those workers to have long-term pay rises, which I think we can all agree that we do want those things, then it has to be a productive, efficient service, and you've got to get those passenger volumes up.
All right, let's get into the case that each of you essentially represents. And starting with you, Paul, would you accept that it won't be the billionaires who pay if the increase that's being asked for, 7% or thereabouts, is delivered? It won't really be billionaires, though that's the popular thing to say, but ordinary commuters, because they'll have to pay increased fares, and ordinary families in the shape of increased taxes to support the infrastructure?
I don't think you can make that direct connection, Trevor. I mean, that ignores the fact, for example, that the train operating companies made £500 million in profits during the pandemic. It ignores the fact that hundreds of millions of pounds were paid out to outsourcing firms to carry out maintenance work on our railways during the pandemic. Now, just going back to what Claire said there, everybody wants to see a successful, thriving, modern, efficient railway in this country. And I'll let you in on a secret. During the pandemic, myself, Mick Lynch, other rail union leaders met on quite a regular basis, actually, with the then Conservative rail minister to talk about not only how we dealt with the pressures of the pandemic, but we also talked about what was going to happen post-pandemic and how we could get people back onto trains and run an effective service. I have to say, all of that came to a crashing halt in October last year when the Chancellor made his spending review, announced slashing funding to our rail services. The shutters then came down. We haven't met a minister since March of this year. So there is scope to have a sensible discussion about how we run a modern railway. I would argue, actually, there's no need for hundreds of millions of pounds to be lost in the system to the private train operating companies. That's a debate to be had. But actually, that discussion needs to involve and engage the workforce, not be imposed upon them. And I've been in lots and lots of private sector organisations where, everywhere from car plants to companies in the insurance and banking sector. And if you want to manage big transition, what you do is try and bring people with you. Okay. And you do things like say, right, what we're going to do is have no compulsory redundancies. That's been completely the opposite approach taken by, I'm afraid, the government and by extension, the train operating companies and Network Rail.
All right, let me put the point about the government meetings to Claire Coutinho, because I think Mr Shapps said that the government had met There'd been dozens of meetings. I think he said 60 or thereabouts. Is it a failure not to have got this sorted out before now?
Well, I mean, I would just say two things. Like the chief executive of Network Rail, and Paul was talking about profits there, that is a public organisation, said that the unions had used strikes as a first resort, not as a last resort, and that they had walked out because that they didn't want to update their working practices. So I'm not sure what the government can do when the union is not putting forward these modernisation measures that we want. And if you look back historically, so you can look back at Labour years, I think, under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, there was strikes with unions at that point, and the unions always say, can the minister come to those meetings? And they didn't in those cases, because actually what you need is very detailed discussions between the employer and the unions about what kind of updates are necessary. And actually, Network Rail said they thought it would be very unhelpful to have a meeting with Grant Shapps, because that is not the technical discussion which needs to take place that they want to see.
Paul Nowak, I just want to be clear about something. On the one hand, I think that the unions were saying last week that the really big problem here was that the government was interfering with negotiations. But this week, they seem to be saying that actually the government should be right at the centre of negotiations. Well, what is the TUC view about this? Should Mr Shapps be in it or he should be out of it?
Well, clearly, Grant Shapps holds the key to unlock this dispute, because actually it is the Department for Transport that sets the financial envelope within which both Network Rail, which is in public hands, and the private train operating companies operate. And there's two interesting things there, Trevor. In the terms of the contracts that the train operating companies have with the DfT, it's very clear that the Secretary of State has the power to direct those companies in regard to issues around employment relations. The other thing is that actually he also has the ability to indemnify those companies if they have losses because of industrial action. So you've got an employer that is effectively not incentivised to reach a resolution because the Department of Transport is effectively writing blank cheques behind the scenes. So I don't think that Grant Shapps can wash his hands of responsibility. I would want him to set a sensible financial envelope that allows the train operating companies and Network Rail to reach a fair resolution. And that's in everybody's interest.
Let me put that to Claire, that Mr Shapps might want to do the Pontius Pilate thing and wash his hands, but he's actually got his fingers in the pie already.
So I think, to be honest, this is a bit of a ruse, because the request for the meeting came on the very date that we had this debate in Parliament. It wasn't there before in the public domain. And actually, what this is trying to divert attention from is that the union has broken down talks with their employer about updating modern working practices. And that's not me, government, saying that. That, as I said, is industry. That is the chief executive of Network Rail, who is saying, actually, the problem is they're not putting forward credible changes, which means that we can get these productivity changes that we need to make the railways work well. All right, let's move on. Let's talk a bit about your, as it were, defence of government, Claire. The truth is, government could afford this. What we're being told by the OBR, I think, is that the Treasury will expect a £30 billion surplus in the public finances. That is 30 billion more receipts in taxes than they plan to spend. Why not spend it supporting people's living standards and getting that money into the economy? Well, firstly, I would say we have actually spent a lot of money on trying to support people's living standards. We've spent £37 billion on doing just that. And actually, one of the things that I haven't heard much from the unions is the fact that a lot of our support will go to the lowest paid workers. That's where the majority of the money goes. So if you're on, I don't know, something like £20,000 and you're in the rail industry and you're on a means-tested benefit, not unlikely, 1 in 3 families in this country are, then you'll be getting £1,200 of support for cost of living this year. You'll also be getting the changes from the universal credit taper rate, which can be as much as £1,000 if you're full-time on the living wage. You also may be getting help from the national insurance thresholds. So you might actually be getting about 9% of support from those things. So why should the taxpayer pay again for another 9% for those workers? And isn't it right that we're trying to target the most money at the people who are the lowest paid? Paul Nowak.
Well, as I said before, Trevor, I think that whatever support that the government has made available to the lowest paid, and let's remember that support came just a few months after the Chancellor ended that uplift in universal credit, just weeks after the Chancellor put up taxes on working people in terms of a national insurance hike. But what it doesn't do is address the central issue, which is that wages are not growing in this country. And it doesn't matter whether you work in the public or private sector, we have got a wages crisis. 1 in 5 people earn less than the real living wage. 3/4 of the kids who live in poverty in this country have at least one parent who goes out to work. Think about that, a parent who goes out to work and their family is still on the breadline. So I think what the government needs to be doing is working with employers and unions to think about how do we boost pay. Now, the government has a direct role in the public sector as an employer. Rishi Sunak told us last year that he was going to end the public sector pay freeze and then told workers this year to expect pay restraint. But in the private sector, there's things that government could be doing as well. It could boost the minimum wage. It could encourage employers to negotiate with unions. Okay. There are some big issues in our economy, and the government is failing on all of them.
Okay, so we're going to have the highest minimum wage, I think, in the whole of Europe. We are boosting it. That's exactly what we did in autumn last year when we were looking at the cost of living crisis in advance. We did the universal credit taper rate. As I said, that means a lot to people who are working in the lowest paid jobs. So I don't think it's right at all to say that government isn't doing anything for the lowest paid. I think that is completely false. I think the question that you need to ask yourself is why taxpayers who are not earning as much as some of the workers in the rail industry should be subsidising a pay increase for them that they themselves are not going to get.
Yeah, I'm not interested in driving wedges between groups of working people. I'd ask the question in the rail industry, why are we paying out hundreds of millions of pounds in profits to private train operating companies? Why not put that money in the pockets of our hard-pressed rail workers?
Because I went to look at the Office of Rail and Road on that, and what they said is that last year, 6 out of the 8 franchising companies paid £38 million in dividends, which was a £200 million decrease on the year before, and about 0.3% of operating income. So I know that the unions want to paint this all as rampant profiteering, but isn't it true that actually out of the £20 billion of income they got last year, £16 billion came from the taxpayer? So what you're talking about is money that's going to come from the taxpayer to fund these wage increases.
Rail services around the world are funded by taxpayers because it's part of having a coherent public transport system. We are almost unique, certainly in Europe, though, in having a rail system where hundreds of millions of pounds of that subsidy effectively ends up in the pockets of private companies. That's the difference.
Yeah. Claire, before we try to see if we can find any common ground here, let me ask you one thing. Ministers have been boasting recently about the fact that the nation's got more jobs available, pretty much, than there are people to fill them. Isn't one consequence of this jobs bonanza, to use a term of art, that Labour now has more leverage? I mean, that's the economics of it. So why are you wanting to interfere with the market? Surely what Mr Lynch and his colleagues are doing are simply following the logic of the market. They've suddenly got this capacity because we're in a tight labour market where they can use their muscle to improve the position for their members. Why does a Conservative government want to interfere with the workings of the market?
So I don't think anyone's view of the market is that, wages should follow profit. So I don't think hurting the economy, therefore reducing the amount of profit that people are creating, is the best way to increase wages across the economy, which is exactly what the rail unions are doing here. But I think generally it's good. I actually am very supportive of unions. I think it's good that they have a collective voice for workers. It's good that they increase their bargaining power. I think it's actually miraculous that we have the strength in the job market that we're seeing. We were very worried about 20% unemployment. And actually, I know some of the unions worked very closely with the government on things like the furlough scheme, which have done so well to preserve jobs. I just don't see why you would now hurt the economy and say that is how we're going to have sustainable wage increases going forward.
All right, let's... we've heard from both of you now and what you think. Let's get to the hard part and see if we can find any common ground or at least some common understanding. There was a time when trade union leaders, employers and politicians would sit down together to try to solve a problem like that. People rather sneeringly describe this as beer and sandwiches, and it sort of went out of fashion. Paul Nowak, would the TUC like to go back to the days of Len Murray, Vic Feather, George Woodcock, and I'm revealing my age when I can remember, because I can remember the names of all of these TUC general secretaries who were big figures who would be in and out of number 10. Is that where you guys want to get back to?
Well, I don't think we want to go exactly back to the 1950s, 60s and 70s, and we do have female trade union leaders now as well, including Frances O'Grady, obviously, at the TUC. You're absolutely right, though, Trevor. There was a period after the war, in fact, and it was it was born out of the contribution that unions made during the Second World War, that there was a post-war consensus that unions had an important role to play. That disappeared at the end of the 70s. I think that there's absolutely much more scope for unions, employers and government to be working together. And Claire mentioned it, you know, the furlough scheme was a really good example of that, actually. The CBI and the TUC working with the Chancellor to put in place a scheme that protected the livelihoods of millions of people. I worked very closely with employers in the Department of Business to develop safe working guidance that kept people safe during the pandemic. But it seems like the government feels that trade unions are only good for a crisis. And it's really regrettable, I think, that the Prime Minister has gone back to what feels like, I have to say, union bashing, rather than accepting that unions have a legitimate role to play, that we're trying to represent working people as effectively as we can. And I think that there is scope to work together on some of these big issues that the UK labour market and indeed the economy face.
Claire?
So, I mean, I don't think that completely represents, but I have a lot of sympathy for Paul's point, because it's true the unions did work very closely with us in government and have done great work over the years for workers' rights. I think they're generally a force for good. I think what we're dealing with here is a very militant branch of a union, which has used a strike as a first resort, as opposed to sitting around the negotiating table, and is now politicking and trying to cause trouble, because, frankly, I just don't think it likes having a Tory government. And what would be actually much better is if the union sat down with the employers, as the employers are asking, and worked out how they can make the railways fit for passengers post-pandemic so it suits their needs. And one of those things is, you know, weekend working. So I actually have a rail franchising line, GTR, which has adopted a lot of these modern working practices. And actually it decided not to strike, and I very much commend those workers for doing so. So these things are possible, but I do think the unions need to do more negotiation and less politicking.
But it won't necessarily be the case for all of the other strikes that are coming down the track. Teachers, doctors are not quite going to be as amenable as you'd like them to be.
Well, I mean, I think there's two things that I would say is I completely sympathise with people saying, look at inflation, we need to have a pay rise. We have an independent pay review body. Those are experts who look exactly at what's going on, and they put forward recommendations, and then government has to look at that. And, of course, government has to have some consideration of affordability, because if they're spending all of their money on pay rises and they don't have the money to do that, they might have to take away from services. So that's something that they need to balance. But everyone has sympathy with people saying, look, cost of living is really hard. The thing that I would also just point to is for the people who are facing the sharpest end of the wedge on cost of living, like I laid out before, there is actually a lot of support. And that's true for teachers, that's true for people who work in the health sector as well.
Is there a case, Paul, for the TUC to remind some of its members, and I know there's some rather unfair comparisons being made about rail workers' salaries. There are very poorly paid members of the RMT, as well as some rather well-paid members of the RMT. But is there a case, perhaps, for reminding those who have industrial muscle and who can essentially use that to bid up the price of their own labour, that might be at the cost of fellow workers?
No, well, let's first of all nail the myth, Trevor, that rail workers are incredibly well paid. In fact, the median wage on the railways is almost exactly the same as the median wage across the country as a whole. In many ways, the RMT are the country's middle workers. They are the middle workers. And I'd ask Claire actually to go down to one of those picket lines and talk to the staff there, because these are not people who are militants or in any way politically motivated. Remember, Mick Lynch doesn't get to vote on whether or not RMT members take industrial action. I don't get to vote. The people who get to vote are the rail workers themselves. And there was 40,000 of them voted to take industrial action. Now, the government changed the law a few years back to make it difficult for people to take industrial action. You now have to have a majority not just of those who vote, but who are eligible to vote. That's a bar that few MPs would pass, actually, in terms of representation. It's a bar we don't put any other type of democratic process in this country. And they voted in accordance with the law, and they voted because they think it's the right thing to do, and they want their employers and the government to listen. So I'd go and talk to people and listen to their stories, because actually these are people who just want a fair deal. They really do want a fair deal. I have talked to some rail worker constituents about this issue,
But isn't it true that the ballot was organised before pay was properly discussed? And isn't it true that what the unions were saying to people is you're not going to get a pay rise this year, which isn't the case? Actually, I think everyone has widely acknowledged repeatedly that there will be a pay rise, but they also need to see some of these modernising changes, which, like I said, I think is a good thing for rail workers to be in better, productive jobs.
Claire, before we move, I want to ask each of you a question before we end, but would it help if the government were to make clear that it's going to resist the calls from some members of your party to essentially impose more restrictive legislation on trade union action, trade union rights? That actually, if you like, as a gesture of goodwill, that the government would say that it might think about restoring some of the rights and powers that trade unions used to have to organise?
So I think what the government is trying to look to do is to work out, in the face of very, very militant union action, how it can keep the economy going. So it's talked about agency workers. I know Paul will have his views on that. It's talked about having a minimum level of service so that you can keep the economy going. And I think Paul would probably have sympathy with this as well, understand why government is saying this is not the time to have a bang to the economy. Actually, what we need to do is make sure that people can recover. And also, we want people to go back and use the trains. We spent £16 billion to keep the railways going because we wanted people to go back and use the trains after the pandemic.
All right, I'm going to ask each of you for 30 seconds to tell me if you've heard anything from this conversation that has made you think again about where you started. Paul?
Well, I respect the fact that Claire recognises that there's a legitimate role for trade unions. I'm just afraid that the government is intent on pulling out the old playbook around union bashing, and I don't think that they appreciate that what unions are trying to do is to represent working people, their families, as effectively as they can. We need to work together to boost wages in this country to get the economy growing again. Attacking trade unions, the very organisations that stand up for working people, won't help that one iota. And, you know, the biggest risk to our economy is working people not having money in their pockets, not spending it in local economies. So there's a responsibility on government to talk sensibly to unions, to talk sensibly to workers and to employers about how we're going to boost wages in this country, rather than raising red flags around some of the discontent and all the rest of it.
So, look, I appreciate Paul as doing his job and representing his members, and I do, you know, like I said, I have a lot of respect for him and what he's doing, but I don't think the way to put money in people's pockets is to stop them getting to work. Okay. That's my bottom line.
All right, well, look, one thing that strikes me, and this hasn't come up in our conversation at all, but I can't help but say, week after week, I come in here and we have these conversations, and I think, how lucky a politician is Boris Johnson that something always comes along to take the limelight off his current difficulties, and that's happened this week. Secondly...
Is it luck or design, Trevor?
One thing that's emerged out of this conversation, which I think is very interesting, is that there might be a place, once again, for beer and sandwiches, partly to, without drawing government into two places it shouldn't be, to take the heat out of some of these issues and maybe perhaps restore a little bit of power to the Trade Union Congress as opposed to some of its more independent, let's call it, members. And maybe, Claire, that might be a way in which this government can distinguish itself from some of its sort of ideological outliers to extend the hand of friendship to trade unions. Anyway, you know, Sky's happy to provide some beer and some sandwiches if everybody wants to get in a room. Thank you very much, both of you, for...
Our unions and the TUC are one and the same, Trevor, I assure you.
Thank you very much for being with us. Stay with us. We will have all today's news coming up after the break.
support communities to grow food in lost and unloved spaces across the city. So our main kind of driving force is to get people growing.
Hello there, good evening to you. You're watching Sky News. Our top stories tonight. Millions of commuters have been affected by rail strikes, which have seen 4/5 of the UK's train services cancelled. Well, the RMT said the turnout on picket lines exceeded expectations, but the government questioned the success of the rail strike as many people opted to work from home to avoid the disruption. And US officials say police in Texas could have stopped an hour-long school shooting in which 21 people died within the first 3 minutes. Well, let's go straight to Washington for more on this then and speak to our US correspondent Mark Stone. And Mark, this